"He's just the old groundskeeper who does our yard," my son-in-law said to his buddies from the base, laughing as he said it, not realizing I was close enough by the garage to hear every word. I kept trimming the hedge like I hadn't heard a thing, because some things you don't correct in front of an audience. You correct them when the moment actually calls for it. My name is Colonel Harold Ashworth, retired, though almost nobody in my daughter's new life had any reason to know that second part. I was 67 years old standing in that driveway, and my own son-in-law had just reduced 31 years of military service to a lawn care arrangement. Let me take you back to how I ended up standing in that driveway in the first place, because none of this makes sense without the context. I spent 31 years in the Air Force, starting as a young second lieutenant and finishing my career as the installation commander of a mid-sized airbase, responsible for everything from flight operations to housing to the welfare of roughly 4,000 personnel and their families. It's the kind of job that ages you in specific ways, teaches you to read a room in seconds, teaches you that the person sweeping the hangar floor deserves the same basic respect as the four-star general walking through it, because you never really know who's who until you look closer. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes with commanding an installation that size, the constant weight of being the person accountable when anything goes wrong, whether that's a training accident, a housing complaint, or a family in crisis. I remembered nights during my last 2 years of command when I'd get calls at 3 in the morning about incidents on base, and I'd be dressed and out the door within 10 minutes, a habit so deeply ingrained that even now, over a decade into retirement, I still wake up instantly at unexpected phone calls late at night, some part of my body still braced for a crisis that isn't coming anymore. I retired 11 years ago. My wife, Marion, and I settled into a quiet life 2 states away from any base, in a house with a big yard that I genuinely enjoy taking care of myself. That's not a cover story. After 3 decades of managing budgets, personnel files, and crisis briefings, there's something deeply satisfying about a task with an obvious physical outcome. You mow the lawn, and it's mowed. Nobody needs a report on it. My daughter, Claire, met her husband, David, about 4 years ago. David is an Air Force officer himself, stationed at a base not far from where Claire eventually moved to be with him. I liked David from the start. He was respectful, hardworking, clearly devoted to Claire, and I never had a single real complaint about him as a husband to my daughter. What I did notice gradually was that Claire had never fully explained my career to him. Not out of any malice, I don't think, but because by the time she met David, I'd already been retired for years, and the version of me she'd grown up with in her adult memory was mostly just her father, who liked yard work and fixing things around the house. She'd tell people I used to be in the Air Force, the same vague phrase you'd use for someone who did a short enlistment decades ago and moved on, not someone who'd commanded an entire installation. I never corrected this, partly because it wasn't really Claire's job to narrate my career to strangers, and partly because, honestly, after 31 years of being defined by rank and responsibility, there was something almost restful about being nobody in particular. I liked being Claire's dad instead of the colonel. I liked it enough that I never pushed to change how I was introduced. David and Claire got engaged 2 years ago, and I started spending more time around David's world. Cookouts with his fellow officers, family days on base, the kind of gatherings where spouses and in-laws get folded into military community life, whether they have a service background or not. It was at one of these gatherings, a housewarming at David and Claire's new place near the base, that the groundskeeper comment happened.
I'd come over that weekend specifically to help with their yard, which had been neglected by the previous tenants, hauling out overgrown shrubs, reseeding patches of dead grass, the kind of hands-on work I still genuinely enjoy. A few of David's fellow officers had stopped by to help with the housewarming setup, and I was out by the garage when I heard David explaining to one of them, a young captain I hadn't met yet, who the older guy trimming the hedges was. "That's just the old groundskeeper who does our yard," David said with an easy laugh. clearly not intending any real disrespect, just filling an awkward silence with the simplest available explanation. I want to be fair to David here. I don't think there was cruelty in it. I think in that moment, groundskeeper was simply the laziest, most convenient label available because he genuinely didn't know the fuller truth, and Claire had never given him reason to ask deeper questions. But hearing your own son-in-law describe you as hired help without a hint of hesitation still lands somewhere specific in a man's chest, even a man who spent 3 decades being called much worse things by much angrier people in much harder circumstances. I didn't say anything that day. I finished the hedges, stayed for the housewarming, made polite conversation, and drove the 2 hours home with Marion that evening, turning the moment over quietly in my mind. The thing is, I want to be honest that this wasn't really the first time. There had been smaller versions of this before, moments at base functions where I'd be introduced simply as Claire's dad, full stop, while other fathers-in-law with far less notable careers got fuller, more respectful introductions because their kids had bothered to explain who they actually were. I'd absorbed each of those moments quietly, telling myself it didn't matter, that my pride shouldn't need external validation at this stage of my life. The groundskeeper comment was just the one that finally settled somewhere I couldn't quietly absorb it anymore.
I didn't bring it up with Claire or David directly. I decided instead to simply let time and circumstance do what I suspected they eventually would. That base, the one David was stationed at, happened to be the exact installation I'd commanded during the final 4 years of my career, before my last assignment took me elsewhere for a brief stint prior to retirement. It wasn't something I'd hidden, it just hadn't come up, because David had arrived at that base nearly a decade after I'd left it, and nothing in his daily routine would have naturally connected my name to the installation's history. That changed about 3 months after the housewarming, when the base held its annual Heritage Day, an event where the installation's history gets put on display for families and new personnel, complete with a hallway of framed photographs of past commanders. I hadn't planned to attend. Claire and David invited me somewhat last minute, mentioning it might be nice for me to see where they'd built their life together. I walked through that hallway of commander portraits with David beside me, and I watched his face when we reached a photograph roughly 2/3 of the way down the row, a formal portrait of a considerably younger version of myself in dress uniform, full colonel's insignia beneath a small brass plate reading my name and years of command. David stopped walking. He looked at the photograph, then at me, then back at the photograph, doing the kind of double take I imagine happens rarely in a person's life. He read the small placard beneath it out loud, quietly, like he needed to hear the words to fully process them. Then he turned to me and asked, in a voice that had lost all its earlier easiness, whether this was actually me. A young airman nearby, overhearing part of the exchange, glanced over, did a quick comparison between my face and the photograph, and said, almost to himself, "Wait, that's Colonel Ashworth? I thought he retired years ago." Words seemed to travel fast in small pockets through that hallway over the next several minutes, a few older personnel who'd served under my command stopping to shake my hand, one master sergeant telling David directly, with clear sincerity, that the housing improvements I'd pushed through during my tenure were still the reason his own family had decent quarters on base today. I told him it was. I told him I'd commanded this base for 4 years, roughly a decade before he'd arrived, responsible during my tenure for a significant expansion of the family housing program and a base-wide safety overhaul following an incident that, as it turned out, David actually knew about from his own initial orientation briefing when he'd first arrived, though he'd never connected the name of the commander responsible for the reforms to his own father-in-law. He was quiet for a long moment in that hallway, other families moving around us, and then he said something I appreciated more than I expected to. He didn't launch into an apology speech. He simply said, "I called you the groundskeeper 3 months ago," like he was working through the full weight of that memory in real time, connecting it to the man standing beside him whose name was on a brass plate in the hallway of the very base he served on. I told him I heard him say it. I watched something shift in his expression, somewhere between embarrassment and a kind of dawning respect that felt different from ordinary politeness, the specific respect of a career officer suddenly understanding he'd been standing next to someone who'd once carried the exact weight he himself was still learning to carry. We didn't have a long, dramatic conversation about it right there in the hallway. It wasn't the moment for that, surrounded by strangers and families. But David was quieter than usual for the rest of that afternoon, thoughtful in a way I recognized from my own younger years, the specific quiet of a man recalibrating his understanding of someone he thought he already had figured out.
He came to see me alone about a week later, drove the 2 hours by himself on a Saturday morning, no advance warning beyond a text saying he wanted to talk. We sat on my back porch and he told me he'd spent the week feeling genuinely embarrassed, not just about the groundskeeper comment itself, but about how easily he'd accepted the smallest, simplest version of who I was without ever asking a real question about it. He asked me carefully why I'd never corrected him, why I'd let groundskeeper and just Claire's dad stand uncorrected for years, when the truth was sitting right there the whole time. I told him the honest answer, which surprised even me a little as I said it out loud. I told him that after 31 years of being defined entirely by rank, by command, by the weight of decisions that affected thousands of people's lives, there had been something genuinely peaceful about being nobody in particular to my own family, about being valued simply as a father and a father-in-law rather than as a title. I told him I hadn't corrected him because some part of me had been enjoying, quietly, the simple dignity of being underestimated. There's a strange freedom in it, I explained, in mowing a lawn and having that be the whole of what someone expects from you. No briefings, no consequences riding on your next decision, just grass that either gets cut or doesn't. But I also told him, honestly, that there's a difference between choosing quiet anonymity and being casually dismissed as hired help by your own family, and that the groundskeeper comment had stung more than I expected it to, precisely because it revealed how little effort had gone into actually knowing me. David apologized, plainly and without excessive drama, the kind of apology that comes from someone who's actually done the reflection rather than one performed for effect. He asked if he could take me to lunch on base sometime, properly introduce me to his commanding officer and colleagues, not as a grand gesture, just as a correction, an actual, accurate introduction instead of a convenient shorthand.
I said yes. We went about 2 weeks later, and I watched David introduce me, this time, as Colonel Harold Ashworth, retired, former commander of the very installation we were standing on. Watched the reactions shift around the room in real time, the particular kind of attention that comes when people realize the quiet older man they'd been politely ignoring built half the infrastructure they walked through every day. Claire, when she found out the full story from David rather than from me, called me that same week, half laughing, half genuinely apologetic, admitting she'd never really thought to explain my career in detail because it had simply never occurred to her that David didn't already understand it the way she did, having grown up with it as ordinary background information rather than something remarkable. She told me she still remembered, vaguely, being a little girl waiting at the base gate for me to come home from long duty stretches, but somewhere between childhood and adulthood, that memory had softened into something abstract. Dad was in the Air Force, rather than something with actual weight and detail attached to it. I don't hold any real grudge against either of them for this. I understand, more than most people probably would, how easy it is to let the people closest to you become flattened into simple, convenient categories, dad, husband, groundskeeper, without ever pausing to ask what fuller truth might be sitting underneath the label. I did plenty of that myself over the years, in my own career, underestimating people until circumstance forced a closer look. What matters more to me now is what's changed since that hallway. David asks me real questions now about decisions I made, about the weight of command, about what it actually meant to be responsible for that base and everyone on it. Claire has started introducing me differently too, without prompting, mentioning my career plainly when it comes up, not out of any particular strategy, just because she finally understands it's a part of who I am worth mentioning accurately. I still do the yard work at their place every few months. I still enjoy it exactly as much as I did before any of this happened. But there's a specific satisfaction now in doing it as myself, fully known, rather than as a convenient, unexamined label that happened to be technically true on the surface while missing everything that actually mattered underneath it. If you've ever been quietly reduced to the smallest, simplest version of yourself by people who never thought to ask deeper, I hope you hear this. You don't need to correct every misunderstanding the moment it happens. Sometimes the truth finds its own way to the surface in its own time, and when it does, what matters most isn't the vindication itself, but whether the people around you are willing to actually see you clearly once it arrives.